Good evening and welcome. My name is Liviu Matei. I am the head of the School of Education, Communication and Society here at King's College. And I wanted to say how happy we are to be able to host this book launch. And perhaps just by way of introduction to the evening, I should say that I read a few articles written by the two authors of the book, but I have not read the book yet. However, I'm looking forward to reading it and buying it. And I encourage all of you to buy it. And I should say that I have no agreement regarding any commission with the authors. But I'm really looking forward to what I'm sure will be a fascinating read, reading the book itself, and then a fascinating discussion this evening. So, and just to explain why, I think it is fascinating. So I work at the School of Education, Communication and Society. I joined quite recently, and this is an amazing place. It is an amazing place because intellectually, in particular, it promotes a very interesting configuration. I don't think we have a monopoly of that, but there is education somewhat at the center, and then social sciences, humanities, and public policy around and in between. And when I say humanities, it is not only philosophy, as in philosophy of education, ethics, or epistemology, which is more common, or languages, but also history. And I think this is very interesting, and it's relatively rare to have history with public policy in particular. And this book, for me, well, I'm not sure they meant that, but it does illustrate this approach. So it deals with trends and issues regarding dyslexia over a long period, 150 years, combining these perspectives and looking at making very important intellectual contributions, but also something that speaks for the practical relevance, or the relevance for practice, educational practice, policy practice. And even if you go through the table of contents, you will see these keywords: policy, dyslexia in the 21st century. So I'm sure it will be a fascinating read. And I was careful to say we don't have the monopoly of this type of configuration. One of the authors of the book is not from ECS, and she still does that. So that speaks for that. And I also wanted to say that I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion. We will have not only the co-authors of the book, but also an ECS alumna, Onyinye, who brings a lot of experience and wisdom, including personal experience. She has written a book about her personal experience with dyslexia. And then we have Darren, who has also done a lot in addressing issues regarding dyslexia. So this will be, I'm sure, a fascinating story. And perhaps I should end with a very short kind of personal story. As I was reading a little bit about the book, I come across a proverb that you all know: knowledge is power. And then I was thinking, how is that in my mother tongue, in Romanian? And we have something that is translated exactly the same, but it doesn't say that. Actually, what the Romanian proverb says is that who can read a book can have a share, can participate. And book in Romanian is carte, very easy to recognize the word. Share, participation is parte, like in part. So that who has carte has parte. So that who can read can participate. And I think there are parts in the book about dyslexia and issues of exclusion, inclusion, including in contemporary societies, going perhaps beyond the traditional meaning of literacy and implication of literacy. So there is that part about social issues regarding dyslexia or related to dyslexia, including in terms of inclusion, exclusion, and that might come up in the discussion today. I have no right to tell the authors or the panelists what to talk about, but I'm sure it will be very interesting. And thank you for being here, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to really celebrate the publication of the book Dyslexia History by Philip Kirby and myself. I'm Maggie Snowling, and I'm here from the University of Oxford. I want to thank King's College London for hosting this event and for all of the very hard work behind the scenes, particularly mentioning Cleo's commitment to this evening. As you've heard, we will have a little bit of discussion about the book, and then there will be a panel discussion, and in a moment I will introduce the panel. But first of all, can I just say that I am not only the co-author of the book, but I'm also the very junior author of the book. The lead author really is Philip, and I really take my hat off to the work he put into writing this book actually during the pandemic, during lockdown. He had a very productive lockdown, which perhaps many of us didn't have. And in the book, I think he distills really excellently the history of the concept, how it related to the science, advocacy, and politics. And these are topics well beyond my own expertise. Cleo asked me to say a little bit about my own experience, and so let me perhaps start by doing that. So I grew up in the 1960s, and that was a time when, you will be aware, there's very little knowledge about dyslexia, and as you'll hear later, it was the time when the Word Blind Centre, the Word Blind Clinic, was first established in London to cater for the needs of children with this specific form of reading difficulties. Now, at that time, my younger brother was having extreme difficulty in learning to read. In school, the school we both went to, there were 4 streams of children, A, B, C, and D. Essentially, I was in the A stream and he was in the D stream. My mother was extremely concerned about my brother's difficulties, and she tried her best to make the school see that there was an issue, and she was simply fobbed off and told, "You can't expect him to be like his bright sister." My brother went on to be a young offender, and as a child growing up and as a teenager, I witnessed the extreme distress and trauma that this brought upon my family, particularly my mother. So I think when I was a young person, I had some unconscious desire to help people. So after reading psychology, I thought about being an educational psychologist, and in fact I had a place on an ed-psych course, and but my final year project supervisor said to me, "Why don't you think about doing a doctorate?" And I thought, well, maybe. I don't know what I'd do that on, but I was very impressed by the work of Uta Frith, who I'm sure many of you know or at least have heard of, and Uta continues to be a great friend and mentor of me. I went to see her about her supervising my doctorate at University College London, and she said, "Well, actually, I've done a lot of work on autism at the moment. I don't think I really want to take you on to work on autism, but what about looking at dyslexia? Because she said it's one of my secret interests, and there's absolutely no research in psychology going on the condition." So therein lies a tale. I started to work on dyslexia. First of all, when I tried to find kids with dyslexia, I was told it didn't exist. But happily, very happily, I stumbled upon Beverly Hornsby, who was one of the pioneers of dyslexia, or one of the doyens often referred to, and she was the head of the Bart's dyslexia clinic. And I went there to collect data, but also to be trained to teach children with dyslexia. In terms of my scientific career, I moved from doing experimental studies of dyslexia to single-case neuropsychological studies and to studies of children at family risk of dyslexia. And at the same time, I undertook a clinical training in psychology because I was aware that although the approach I was taking was cognitive, that many of the difficulties that are encountered in managing children with dyslexia turn into family problems. So I wanted to learn about that. Pulling the two strands together, I was at the University of York for 18 years, where I established a clinic for the assessment and management of children and families with dyslexia and related conditions. And ultimately, through that work, was invited by Sir Jim Rose to serve on the expert panel for the Rose Review, which was an independent report to government published in 2009 regarding essentially teaching children with dyslexia and other specific learning difficulties. So that's my history. How does this relate to the project? Well, in 1997, I was chair of the British Dyslexia Association's international conference, and we labelled the seminar rooms with the names of key figures in the history of dyslexia. And to my astonishment, my graduate students had no idea who these people were. And I thought then, really, we should write down a history of dyslexia. I was also aware that I knew a lot of the pioneers in the field, people who had done the initial research and people who had set up organisations like the British Dyslexia Association, Dyslexia Action, and so on. And so I really did think that when I retired, I would do a project which would be the history of dyslexia, and we would look into really how the whole concept and awareness of dyslexia evolved. But then in 2012, I went to Oxford and started talking to historians. So I am no historian. In fact, I had to give it up in the second year of secondary school because I was so bad at it. And they said to me, why wait for retirement? We should be doing this now. So we embarked upon the project, funded by the Wellcome Trust Infrastructure Fund and St John's College. And we assembled a team of historians and psychologists. And we really lucked out when Philip applied to work with us, and he brought to the table expertise actually in human geography. So, with no further ado, you will know that the book tonight, The History of Dyslexia, was written by two people, neither of whom are historians. Now, let me perhaps introduce the panel, and in order to do this, I have a slide to help me. So, Philip Kirby, who is the lead author of the book, is lecturer in social justice here at King's College London, and he will speak in a moment about the book. Then we're very pleased to be joined by Onyinye Udokporo, who is an alumna of St John's, an entrepreneur, and who founded the platform Enrich Education, and Darren Clark, who is the chief executive of the charity Succeed With Dyslexia. With no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Phil, who's going to tell you a little bit about the book.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you for those kind words. I think actually the workload was quite balanced between us and the writing, and I certainly enjoyed the process. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's very good to see you all. Thank you for braving the cold. So my job now is to give you a little bit of an overview of the book. So I'm going to take you through each of the chapters and then try to highlight a couple of interesting stories from each. I can't guarantee it'll be as interesting as the Prince Harry memoirs, but I'll do my best. So where did dyslexia come from? So we have to go back to 1877. There was a German physician, Adolf Kussmaul, and he first identified this condition called word blindness. Now, there's some debate over whether exactly Kussmaul had identified what we would call dyslexia today, but he was the first to identify that reading difficulties could be present absent other types of difficulties or general difficulties. The cases that he was presented with were initially introduced to him as being problems with visual acuity of the children that he was working with. So that's where that term word blindness came from, even though that was inaccurate. It was nothing to do with visual acuity, but that term word blindness actually lasts for several decades. The term dyslexia, meaning trouble with words, that comes in 1883, and that was Kussmaul's compatriot, Rudolf Berlin, who was an ophthalmologist. Again, similar types of patients Berlin was seeing to Kussmaul, probably not what we would call dyslexic today, but again, reading difficulties that seem to be absent from other broader difficulties. We then need to cross the channel. So in 1896, we start to see that British physicians take charge of dyslexia research. Again, it's still under the term word blindness at this point. So a key figure here is William Pringle Morgan, who is a physician in Seaford, Sussex. So he's quite small, but he's top left on the screen here. And this is where he does start to talk about patients that seem to have dyslexia in the way that we would understand it today. So this is William Pringle Morgan's account, very famous account of Percy from 1896. Percy F., a well-grown lad aged 14, is the eldest son of intelligent parents, the second child of a family of 7. He has always been a bright and intelligent boy, quick at games, and in no way inferior to others of his age. His great difficulty has been, and is now, his inability to learn to read. This inability is so remarkable and so pronounced that I have no doubt it is due to some congenital defect. He has been at school or under tutors since he was 7 years old, and the greatest efforts have been made to teach him to read, but in spite of this laborious and persistent training, he can only with difficulty spell out words of one syllable. So again, a description of a child with dyslexia, probably very familiar to a description that you might write about a child with dyslexia today. And this was written in the late 19th century. Another prominent name here is James Hinshelwood, who was a Scottish physician. And he was responsible for actually removing a lot of stigma from the types of difficulties that children with dyslexia were facing, or at least he tried to do that. He was also able to highlight that dyslexia was probably an issue with phonological decoding. And again, that was something that will come to the fore in science later in the 20th century and would be borne out. So this is Hinshelwood. It is a matter of the highest importance to recognize the cause and the true nature of this difficulty in learning to read, which is experienced by these children. Otherwise, they may be harshly treated as imbeciles or incorrigibles and either neglected or flogged for a defect for which they are in no ways responsible. The recognition of the true character of the difficulty will lead the parents and teachers of these children to deal with them in a proper way, not by harsh and severe treatment, but by attempting to overcome the difficulty by patient and persistent training. So actually, a lot of the descriptions of dyslexia at that time, again, were borne out by later science and were actually quite progressive in the way they were talking about dyslexic children. In Britain, we then have a curious lull in interest. So Hinshelwood stops writing about 1920, and right through to about 1960, there's actually very little interest in dyslexia in Britain. We think there are probably several reasons for this. So one reason is that, again, if you can just see on the top right-hand side here, that's Cyril Burt. So Cyril Burt was a very notable educational psychologist of the early 20th century. He was a very controversial figure. He was a eugenicist, and after he died, it emerged that a lot of his research had been fabricated. For the purposes of dyslexia, he was very against the term. So he publishes this counterblast to dyslexia in the 1940s, for example. So it's possible that his shadow was looming large over dyslexia research in the early 20th century, and that might be one reason that it wasn't progressing during that period. Obviously, there were 2 world wars, so it's possible also that psychologist attention was actually transferring to returning servicemen, perhaps, rather than looking at educational psychology. So that may be one reason for that lull in Britain. So this is Cyril Burt, again capturing this kind of dismissive nature of his comments on dyslexia. Nearly every educational psychologist has had cases referred to him in which this verdict, word blindness, as it was still being called, has been pronounced. And it now seems pretty well agreed that, provided adequate and appropriate teaching can be arranged, practically all such cases will respond, as well as their intelligence and other abilities will permit. So very dismissive of the term. Elsewhere, though, there was more interest in dyslexia in the early 20th century. So we have Samuel Orton, one down from the top on the left-hand side here. So he was an American physician, and he was much more sympathetic to the term. And he also introduced actual interventions for children that had dyslexia, so phonological training that might improve their condition. So this is Orton, the tentative envisagement of the disability here and outlined. He writes in this kind of very verbose style, would suggest that the logical training for these children would be that of extremely thorough repetitive drill on the fundamentals of phonic association with letter forms, both visually presented and reproduced in writing, until the correct associations were built up. And again, that kind of phonological intervention has stood the test of time. He was also assisted by Bessie Stillman and Anna Gillingham, who were other American psychologists, and the multisensory intervention that they all put together in unison is actually still used today. So very influential figures in the early part of the 20th century. In the mid-20th century, we then start to see more coalescing of interest in dyslexia internationally. So in Copenhagen, the Wordblind Institute is opened in the late 1930s. The Orton Society, following the work of Samuel Orton, is founded in America in the 1940s by his widow, June. And as Maggie mentioned earlier, the London Wordblind Centre opens in 1962. So the London Wordblind Centre, based in Bloomsbury, that brought together the kind of nascent interests of researchers across Britain and actually further afield in this entity known as word blindness or dyslexia. And it's about this time that we start to lose traction for the term word blindness, and dyslexia starts to replace it. So word blindness being so inappropriate to what we're seeing, dyslexia comes to the fore. Sanjay Naidu, who's one down on the right here. So she was the director of the Wordblind Centre, and this is her commenting on the Wordblind Centre's closing in the 1970s. The centre has closed and the staff dispersed. Happily, plans for further help have been made for most of the children. Those who have taken part in this enterprise may be allowed to combine with gratitude for the opportunity to serve a modicum of pride in having gained more recognition and secured more sympathy and help for a group of disadvantaged pupils. They all share disappointment that the day has not yet dawned when responsibility for providing for the special needs of this group is fully recognised throughout the education service. They must be content with the thought that they have brought that dawn a little nearer. So the Wordblind Centre was crucial in Britain, and I think also internationally, in actually starting to build up a bit of a research base for dyslexia, and also to start to think about interventions that might be used for children with dyslexia. After that, we see that research really starts to take off, especially from the 1960s. So in 1964, we have the Isle of Wight studies, which were led by Mike Rutter, so a very notable psychologist, late of King's College London. And those Isle of Wight studies, again, start to lay out a real evidence base for dyslexia, and they start to get an idea of how common it might be in the population. So that was Mike Rutter and Bill Ewell that led those studies. And again, research started to coalesce around this idea as dyslexia as some kind of phonological decoding difficulty, which again is pretty much how it's considered today, and started to provide an evidence base that political movements, that advocacy movements, campaign movements would then build on to gain societal and political recognition of dyslexia. So in the 1970s, we see that civil society interest in dyslexia really start to take off. So in 1972, and I know we have representatives from the BDA here, the British Dyslexia Association is founded by Marion Welshman. So she's the lady bottom right there. The Dyslexia Institute is also founded in 1972, the Helen R. Kell Centre, and various organisations in Britain, mainly in the southeast, start to advocate for dyslexic children's rights and to get political recognition for dyslexia. So this is Marion Welshman talking about her interest in dyslexia. Her son had dyslexia. The gradual process of our son learning to read, write, and comprehend was like unlocking a secret casket. It was also at this time that we start to see the association of dyslexia with the middle classes and with worried mothers in particular. So many of these organisations, the British Dyslexia Association, the Dyslexia Institute, the Helen R. Kell Centre, they were founded by mothers of dyslexic children. Often they were women of means, in the sense that they were able to volunteer their time to set up these organisations. And so we start to see a lot of dismissals of their work in quite gendered terms, and we start to see this idea that dyslexia might just be a middle-class myth. Actually, that's unfair. It was really just because of the demographics of that time and who was in a position to actually start to create this dyslexia infrastructure that those associations occurred. So the BDA, the Dyslexia Institute, these other advocacy organisations, from the 1970s onwards, they really start lobbying for recognition, political recognition of dyslexia. But for several decades, there was substantial government pushback. So this is crystallised particularly well in the 1978 review by Baroness Warnock of special educational needs. So Warnock had been charged with trying to understand why certain children were struggling to learn and to find interventions that might help them. At this time, Margaret Thatcher was the Education Secretary, and the civil servant in charge of Warnock's review was very hostile to the concept of dyslexia, whether coming from Thatcher herself or not. So this is Warnock talking about her experience of that review. The hostility in the Department of Education to this concept, dyslexia, was manifest by the instructions we were given when we were set up at the beginning of '74, when I was summoned by the person in the department who was responsible for the committee. He said, "You understand your terms of reference?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Well, you must understand that you must not suggest that there is a special category of learning difficulty called dyslexia." So this was quite a visible pushback by government against the term, but we see this actually in closed-door meetings right across the 1960s and 1970s and into the 1980s. Why was this happening? Well, presumably government were somewhat reticent to expend the kind of resources that would be needed to actually help children with dyslexia. The evidence base was still emerging, so they were able to point to disagreements in the science as one reason that they wouldn't need to fund this condition. Nevertheless, these organisations kept going, and by the late 1980s, we do see parliamentary recognition for dyslexia, ironically, of course, under Thatcher's prime ministership. So, where are we today? Well, I think it's fair to say that dyslexia awareness and support is greater than it's ever been. So, we almost had our first dyslexic prime minister, Penny Mordaunt. But there are still storms on the horizon. So the dyslexia debate rumbles on, exactly how we should define dyslexia, how to distinguish dyslexia from other types of reading difficulty, how to treat and intervene with those who have dyslexia. Those debates are still here, and some people use those debates to cast shade on the term. I think it's also possible, though, that as new technologies develop, that perhaps literacy will become slightly less important than it has been previously. So perhaps there are more optimistic signs for people with dyslexia going forward. But one thing is clear, and that's that the history of dyslexia is very much still unfolding. So I will pass back to Maggie at that point.
Thank you very much indeed. So Onyinye, would you like to tell us a little bit about your book and about the impact that dyslexia has had on your life?
Hello everyone, my name is Onyinye. I am the author of the book Dyslexia and Me, How to Survive and Thrive If You're Neurodivergent. The book came about through a DM on Instagram, so if we're talking about history, the first thing of history is that the world is changing and technology is at the center of pretty much everything that we do, and we can't avoid it. And I think we should use it to try and make lives like mine better. But after going back and forth and deciding whether I will write the book or not, I decided to go back and think about, well, how did dyslexia affect me? I was diagnosed aged 11, but prior to that, so age 0 to 11, I have the most loving parents who put a lot of effort into me, and I also have an undiagnosed dyslexic mum. And my book begins with a spelling test. My parents are big educators. I'm of Nigerian heritage. So if you know anything about Nigerians, I'm sitting here, before leaving the house, they asked, when are you doing your PhD? So that should give you some context. But the book starts with a story of me doing a spelling test in their bedroom with my brother, who happens to be 13 months younger. Now, there's something about brothers. Philip's brother, Maggie's brother. So, you know, my brother being so close in age to me and me not being able to spell the word soap, I spelt it S-O-O-P, so there's the phonological thing. And my brother smirked and went S-O-A-P, and I could see the dread in my dad's face, even though I was about 5 years old, like, why can't you spell? Why can't you read? Why are you not writing properly? But you are bright. And I've always been quite articulate. And my mum took me out of the room and she whispered into my ear that she had that problem too, and she would make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. So as a result, she finished school and went to university, but she's an entrepreneur, and guess what? So am I. So we fast forward to now, and I run 2 businesses. But I wrote the book because if you have a look at the pictures on the board, I'm just going to address the awkward elephant, turtle, whatever animal in the room. There is no one of colour in this history of dyslexia, and that cannot be accurate if we're talking about the history of dyslexia. Now, it's not to blame the authors. The truth is that the information that is public is Eurocentric, unfortunately. But the fact is, dyslexia is something that is global, that will affect people across the world. And I wonder what dyslexia is like in the country of my heritage, like Nigeria, or anywhere else in the world, in Asia. And so that's why that's why I wrote my book, and that's why I've been sharing my story online. I started on LinkedIn when I was about 18, 19 years old. For all the younger people in the room, don't sleep on LinkedIn. Like, it is going to be the new TikTok, I'm telling you. But putting that aside, I started to share my story because I realized that no one that looked anything remotely like me had dyslexia, and I thought that I had an illness. I thought that I was a broken black person. So when I was diagnosed at 11, my diagnosis came about because I won a scholarship to a very prestigious school that had the funding for me to have a diagnostic assessment. At the moment, the average cost of one of those is about £600. I said average, so most people get quoted a lot more than that. If you are dyslexic and from a background like mine, you just won't get diagnosed. You live your life with so many different problems. But when I did get diagnosed, the teachers put 3 photos in front of me: Richard Branson, Jamie Oliver, and Albert Einstein. And I say this in the book, and I'll say it again. There's an issue. Albert Einstein's dead. Jamie Oliver, I love you, but no. Just no. And Richard Branson, I'm an entrepreneur now, but at the time I had no relation to this man whatsoever. And so I went back to my boarding house and I Googled black dyslexic people, and it wasn't until I got onto like page 10 that Whoopi Goldberg showed up. So she is dyslexic, but the point is that I had no one and nothing. So I went through all my childhood, most of my adulthood, feeling as though I was broken for my race. And then in my culture, in black communities and in other ethnic minority communities, anything to do with special educational needs, learning difficulties, neurodivergence is taboo. So when they told my mum that I had dyslexia, she said my child doesn't have a disease, which, you know, you can't blame her. And at 11, I had the responsibility of telling her that it's not a disease. So to answer your question, I answered that book to be the face and the voice of so many that are in a situation like me or possibly worse and don't have anyone who's advocating for them. No pressure, but I'm hoping that we have a part 2 to the book, because history is both present and past. And I'm hoping that in the part 2 of the book, we see faces like mine and faces of all colours, creeds and circumstance that also talk about dyslexia and have that experience too.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So that leads very nicely, Darren, to you too. Perhaps you can tell us how you got involved in advocacy and maybe give us a case that's going on now, that, you know, typical example.
Absolutely. So I'm not an author yet. I have read a book. I think it was Topsy and Tim, so for the people my age bracket. So for me, I was diagnosed quite late, at the age of 36. So apparently that's quite common, which is quite sad. And obviously a lot of kind of advocacy and I guess awareness needs to kind of take place, as well as the educational side of it and professors and science and everything else. I think it all kind of accumulates into this amazing thing that we're doing to kind of raise more awareness. So how did I get into the kind of the dyslexia world? So I absolutely love education, but I feel I was deprived of education through schooling because of undiagnosed dyslexia. So I grew up in a state school in Bristol. I remember it had barbed wire all the way around the kind of the perimeter, and I wasn't too sure whether it was to keep the kids in or keep us out. But it was I guess what we would say is a school of hard knocks, really. So it was a tough school, and a lot of my schooling was spent in kind of this thing called the unit. Now that's not a special police force. It was a porta cabin, which was kind of put in the middle of the school playing field for. I guess it was only meant to be there for 6 months, but it ended up being there for years and years and years. And you can imagine this place. It was kind of, you know, when it was winter, it was freezing cold, and you know the condensation. And when it was the summer, it was you know boiling hot. And I guess the only thing that kind of kept me occupied for the 5 years of my schooling there was a colouring in book. Not just one, there were several. I was quite lucky. Colouring books and dot to dots. And that was kind of thing. I think I counted about 136 teachers throughout my time there. And what I realised is that I wasn't actually having a teacher. What I was having was someone who was just making sure that I was there and safe and carrying on schooling. So subsequently, I left school with not a single GCSE qualifications, and I find it very difficult to read and write. Now, as we know, when everyone leaves school, it's a massive competition in the sense of, you know, you're trying to get college and university and all these different amazing further education. But besides that, the workplace is an incredibly competitive place. Now, if you try and get yourself into the workplace with no GCSEs, no qualifications whatsoever, and you try and fill in application forms and you're struggling to read and write, you're in a pretty difficult situation to further your kind of career. So my mum used to spend ages helping me fill out all these different application forms, and I've always been entrepreneurial in kind of growing up, setting up little, you know, side businesses and everything else. Because I couldn't get the education I needed from school, I would kind of teach myself about business and everything else. So I subsequently, after probably like 25, 26 application forms, I managed to get my first job in Sainsbury's, 12 hours a week pushing trolleys. But to me, that was the most important job ever, because someone had given me the responsibility, and I can actually, even, you know, we could say it was just pushing trolleys, but for me, every role that I've done, I've been, I thought it was the most important role within that business, because if it wasn't me collecting the trolleys, then no one could put the goods into the trolleys, so then no one can get paid, and so on and so on and so on. So every single thing that I go into, regardless of whatever stage or category or hierarchy or whatever it is that the business industry kind of equates to, I always find it's the most important role that we're doing. So fast forward, I managed to hustle my way to become a regional director of Tesco's and looking after many stores and huge budgets and everything else. And that was great, very stressful, still undiagnosed dyslexia. And then I left that and then set up lots of different businesses. But how I got diagnosed with dyslexia was, I was about 1.5 years into my own business. And I don't know if people can kind of relate to where you know, how they found out they was dyslexic, or, you know, how they got tested or whatever. But for me, it was quite a poignant moment, because I was at home and I was working on my laptop, and there was a TV program, I think it was like Points West or something, in the afternoon. They were interviewing a florist. And I thought they were just interviewing her to ask her about business. And I was sort of working on the laptop and listening, and I was intrigued because she was talking. I thought, oh, I'm an entrepreneur, I've got to listen to this. And she kept saying, I struggle to spell the flowers that I put in the bouquet, but I can tell you from the colour and the smell and everything else. I'm a very visual person. I see everything in pictures. And I was thinking, okay, yeah. So I kind of slid the laptop to the side and just kept watching. And she kept saying this word dyslexia. I never heard of it before. At the age of 36, never even came across that word. And then she started talking about how she feels and how she deals with certain things. And it was the first time in my life that I felt that someone had actually spoken to me of how I actually felt. Like, I would explain ants moving around on paper and not being able to concentrate and forgetting everything. But that was the first moment. So I then, you know, once I found out how to spell dyslexia, I Googled it. And then the journey for me kind of went, you know, the BDA, British Dyslexia Association, was fantastic. And then got diagnosed with dyslexia, and then 2 years later with ADHD. So prior to that, the advocacy work that I've done over the years is, I've always been a big believer in giving back. And when I started my business, I started going into schools and giving business talks. I didn't even know they did such a thing. I just kind of sent an email out and asked if I could go in and talk to them about business. And I did that, and I spoke to probably just shy of 100,000 students over a 4-year period. Now, this was, the beauty of that is, I'd say 30,000 of them when I first started was about business. But because I got diagnosed, I could then go into the schools and start speaking about business, entrepreneurship, and dyslexia. And that was then kind of led me onto the work that I've done. So I guess my role now within Succeed With Dyslexia as the CEO is to kind of raise awareness through campaigns and everything we've done. But I've done some fantastic things with some amazing schools in different parts of the world, in Israel, America, Kenya, Malawi, and they've been absolutely fantastic, the stuff we've done. But equally again in the UK, and I feel that we're very lucky in one aspect, that when I've seen how dyslexia is perceived in so many different countries to what we have in the UK, there's still massive amounts of work to be done. But we're very blessed that we have the British Dyslexia Association, and we have all the other different organisations around us that are kind of supporting. But I was most amazed when I reached out, and I'll just end with this, to two unbelievable entrepreneurial ladies who have just become more family than friends. And it's a lady called Phyllis and her sister Nancy, and they started this school in Kenya called the Rare Gem Talent School. Please Google it, please, not now, but please Google it and check it out. Two absolute wonderful sisters, and their story really kind of touched my heart. They set the school up because their children were denied education, because the marks that the school wanted to get wouldn't allow them, so the students were underperforming due to their dyslexia. So they asked the students to leave, so they started homeschooling. They knew nothing about dyslexia, and they just figured it was dyslexia. So Phyllis and Nancy worked really hard on educating themselves around dyslexia. They started homeschooling their two sons, and then other people that were kicked out of the school would then become tutored by them. The problem was, within there was a very kind of big religious kind of belief around this. So they thought that these children were cursed. So they were actually charged out of the village that they were in, and they had to set up home somewhere else. And then the most inspirational thing is that they didn't stop teaching, they then built a school. Now, to date, they have 196 students in there that they're educating. We've done some incredible work to fundraise, and they're in the first stage now of building another school, so they'll double the amount of students. And this is where I feel I've been deprived of my education, yes, but I'm like yourself. I feel like I sponge every single day, just absorbing and wanting to learn. And I just feel if we can together make more awareness and share more stories and make it more acceptable, we can do some amazing work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. in a moment we're going to open up for questions from the audience, but just before we do that, I think I have chair's privilege of asking each of the speakers one question. That's what my instructions say. So, first of all, Philip, I think of a hard one
Maggie.
for you. Can I just ask you about terminology? People with dyslexia have been called all sorts of things. Our Department for Education liked the term children failing to reach age-related expectations. There are other terms in the literature. My question is, do you have a view as to whether giving this problem a label is important? And if so, from all the interviews you've undertaken, what should the label be?
Thank you, Maggie. Yes, that is a tough question. Well, my personal view is I think that the term dyslexia is important. I think in part because of what we do in the book, where we profile kind of all the work that has gone into that term, how meaningful that term has been actually for people with dyslexia over many decades. It's a relatively accurate term, trouble with words, much more accurate than something like word blindness. So I think that the term has a lot of validity in that sense, and there's now a lot of investment in it. So in terms of kind of the labelling agenda, again, I'm sure the audience will know that there are a lot of positives and negatives to placing labels on people. My view, I suppose, with the kind of arguments around dyslexia's political recognition and all the challenges to dyslexia's political recognition is that the dyslexia label is hugely useful in directing funding towards this particular issue. It's very useful for advocates and for lobbyists to have that label, which they can then take to policymakers and seek to get funding directed towards it. So my personal view is that the dyslexia label is here to stay, and it should stay.
Thank you very much. Onyinye, thank you for addressing the elephant in the room. I think that's very, very important indeed. You can't, on your own, be the advocate for people of colour. What should we be doing to encourage more people from ethnic minorities and also from other disadvantaged groups to actually express their difficulties and appeal for identification?
I think the first thing is having the topic of dyslexia discussed in places where it's not ordinarily discussed. So one of the things that I do is I go to churches, I go to mosques, I go into schools, but I'll go into schools in the most underserved communities, in the most underserved areas, and I talk about dyslexia, I talk about my experience. The reason why I go into religious institutions, like Darren has briefly mentioned, is that for certain cultures, there is a belief that if you are dyslexic, you are cursed. There is a belief that if you take your child to the reverend, the minister, the pastor, the imam, whatever spiritual entity, that dyslexia will be taken away. And I think all of us in this room can agree that that's simply just not the case. So that's the first thing, is we need to stop putting dyslexia in such hard to reach environments. From my tutoring business, I know a lot of parents would have loved to be at this event, but they're terrified of coming into a university. They've never been to university themselves. So like, I'm going to be sharing your book with them, for example, and maybe it might be a bit inaccessible because of the vocab, but I will explain to them what it is that you're trying to say. The second thing is that we need more campaigns about dyslexia and neurodivergence more widely that show people from various different backgrounds. I would like to see advertisement that shows someone struggling with dyslexia. I genuinely am working on this though with brands, because I think at the moment dyslexia is shown to be a very white middle class issue, and people are making efforts, but it's not necessarily the right efforts. And then I think the third thing is people like yourselves continuing to do the work that you do, because it's not easy to write a book. I speak from experience. There were times where, I'm dyslexic as well. So there were times I would sit there and be like, what am I doing? This is so hard. It's 1 a.m. Nothing's coming out right. And also dyslexia, like you said, the term is very important for that funding. It's not funded properly. We had the dyslexia bill. Matt Hancock decides to go on I'm a Celebrity. don't even get me started. And then it's dropped. The dyslexia bill has been dropped, and we're going to have to go all over again and try and bring it into Parliament. And so we can't stop the work that we're doing. We can't get exhausted. We have to keep going. Those are the ways in which I think we're going to make the change and see it across different cultures.
Thank you. You mentioned the other elephant in the room, Matt Hancock.
I did do a piece for the Times. He is an interesting character because I think he genuinely has struggled with his dyslexia in his own life, and whether someone is white or middle class, whatever their background is, I would never take that away from them. But then, it makes our job a lot harder. What are you doing? And, because the Times asked me, do I think it's going to help raise the profile of dyslexia? My response was very simple. If you want to raise the profile of dyslexia, I'd like to see you on Countdown. That's the only show where we're going to know, wow, this is what dyslexic people have to go through. If you eat the testicles of an orangutan, it's not really going to show your dyslexia. So I think, there is work to be done. And why don't Countdown do an edition of dyslexic people? Not only would it be a good laugh, because I think you have to learn to laugh at yourself at times, but it would genuinely make people see, okay, this is how their minds work. This is how hard it is for them. Let's put things in place. Like they did for me at King's. They put so much in place for me here to thrive so that they can do well doing academic stuff.
Darren, where is the activist movement now? And are there things researchers can do to assist?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just to touch on the Matt Hancock thing only briefly. I interviewed him back when he, and I guess we were really quite disappointed because at the time there was a lot of movement in the sense of trying to get this this bill passed and everything. And I remember interviewing him, and it was the most surreal thing ever. And then obviously the celebrity thing, and then it all dropped. But yeah, hopefully there'll be. I think the Countdown idea is a great one. As opposed to the advocacy thing, I'm continuously. I love marketing. I love storytelling and making kind of, I guess, sharing people's stories and really kind of putting out there the real kind of boots on the ground kind of dyslexic thinking. Because we do have some incredible organisations out there, and sometimes it is white middle class, and sometimes it is very kind of celebrity endorsed in that sense. And I guess I was you're trying to find how it relates to everyone within the circumstances that they're in. So I think for anything, if there's a campaign going on, or I know within Succeed With Dyslexia we always do a campaign. As many campaigns as we can, and these are all done on literally just done on awareness. And sometimes they think there's a bit of a catch. They think there's what you're trying to sell and something else. But genuinely, it's having those stories being told. And I think I just want to touch on the point you said about people feeling scared to share the stories, or not being able to be in the right environments to have that opportunity. I look back on the people that I've spoken to, and we had this conversation before, the amount of people that will DM you, and as soon as they meet you, they'll tell you your story about what they've done, and sometimes being quite emotional in that sense, you take it all in, and you try and serve the people the best you can. So you need to think of this on a bigger scale of how do people are able to kind of communicate, not just through us, but just genuinely on the wider public. And I think there's so many different ways. I think if there's a campaign going on or something else, then to get involved in that would be fantastic. Creating the right space in the environment, whether it's I don't know, online, or whether it's communities or coffee mornings or things. I think the workplace has a massive step. If we look at the educational side of it, there's some phenomenal stuff that's been happening throughout the educational stuff over the past 10 years. Still a long way to go, but I feel the workplace, and again, this is just a personal an opinion, I feel like the workplace is what the educational side of the thing was like 10, 15 years ago. What would be iconic, I guess, is if we were able to take someone, look at the dyslexic journey of someone in school being helped and support, and then they go to college and university and help and support, and they go into the workplace and there's help and support. And we're not saying that this person has to be, given a special treatment or anywhere else. We don't want that. but just having the tools to be able to do their job and being, treated in a way of that kind of element of support. And I know that's kind of, I don't know, the unicorn, I guess, of how it works. But I personally, I've worked with big brands like Netflix and Amazon in HSBC, and they've done some phenomenal things to make, raise these awareness. But think about your organisation. Is there an organisation that you work for, that do they do awareness training? Do they have these conversations? And I think a lot of the times it's like opening Pandora's box, because if you have someone come in and do a talk about dyslexia and someone raises awareness, you have to have that support to answer these questions. And this is why I feel, personally, when I worked, when I was a consultant, worked with HSBC and I was speaking to the CEO, I was trying to explain exactly that it goes for everyone. It's not just the people at the front on the tills, doing the cashier side of it. It's the whole company. So I think the workplace plays a massive part. I think that personally is a movement that needs to kind of happen, as well as the support within the educational side of it.
That's why I quit my job on the day I was meant to start. And I think it's really important that I share that, that it's not, because I realize my story sounds really successful, but there have been some really sad, depressing, anxiety-inducing moments. Don't quit your job on the day you're meant to start. But I did it for a whole host of reasons, one of them being that I knew my dyslexia in that organization was going to be a problem. And I had gotten used to having the support in school, having the support here when I was at King's for both degrees. And I could see at this organization, a very big, respectable organization, you're sending me emails in font size 10 in a non-dyslexia font with no line spacing. Only God knows what the briefing pack is going to look like. That was the first thing that I opened. I just thought, no, this is not going to work out. So the workplace has a lot to account for. People wonder why a lot of dyslexic people are entrepreneurs. It's because we know that we're probably going to get sacked if we go and work for someone. So we have to figure it out ourselves. So you're right, the workplace has a lot to work on.
So true. So now I think we're going to open up to questions from the audience. You can target them. So there's some roving mics, they're clear. Yeah.
Thank you. I had a question surrounding sort of the attitudes towards dyslexia. So sort of as a bit of background, I run a neurodivergent specialist tuition agency for sort of peer-on-peer tuition. And in my experience, a lot of the kids who are especially younger, so the eldest that we teach is 16. So they're kids in primary, secondary, and they get told that they have dyslexia, ADHD, autism, whatever it is. And it often, as you said, seems like a bad thing that they've been told it, or they come and they say, oh, I've been diagnosed with dyslexia. Now I've got to go to, the Senko department in school, and it's really embarrassing, or whatever it is. So my question is, how do you think we can show kids at a really young age that being diagnosed isn't a bad thing, and in fact having that neurodivergence will give them abilities that their friends might not have? They might be a better entrepreneur, they might be a better logical thinker. How do you think we can sort of portray that to those kids?
Who wants to take that one?
I think personally, sometimes when we look at someone who has dyslexia as a child, there seems to be this great expectation. So I go back to when you said about your dyslexia, and they thrust 3 very successful people in front of you. And suddenly this expectation is you could be the next Richard Branson. So I could be a billionaire that flies a rocket out of space, but I'm struggling to read the board and my friends are making fun of me. So it's almost living in the situation of now and celebrating the successes. Now, and I think it comes down to what each person in this room deems success in a different way. Success could be being a billionaire. Success could be, I don't know, being able to go to the petrol station, putting £20 in and not worrying. Or it could be just being able to function and do other bits and pieces, or start a business. So these elements, and I feel, for me personally, it's been around surrounding yourself with like-minded people, and that's very difficult in the school side of it, but I think it does come down to that awareness of how the people around them perceive the dyslexia. So how is the teacher, I guess, having these conversations about dyslexia? How is the separation happening? So for me, in my school, it was a case of we take that student out because they need support. You know, and sometimes it's the terminology of how we, talk to people. So I guess it's definitely more awareness around that and enhancing the more positive skills that we do have. And I'm not I'm not going to turn around and say it's my superpower in this sense, but there are things within my neurodiverse mind that I feel that I do have the cutting edge over certain things, and other things I lack in. So I do think it's celebrating those things. It's surrounding yourself with the people that, with the knowledge, and I think it comes down to the terminology as well. That's just my...
I think you should also give them an activity that is, so tap into their strength. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at 11. I started my first business at 12. My mum noticed that, like, I'm really good at selling. I'm just an entrepreneur by nature, and so she allowed me to turn her living room into a tuition center. Now, you might not want to do that, but just giving them activities that let them tap into their excellence without the pressure of becoming the next Richard Branson, because that doesn't necessarily help. I think that would really change things for them.
There's another question here.
Well, actually, it was just I wanted to add to what you're saying. So I work in a primary school, and I just wanted to say, in terms of what I've found, I am also dyslexic. I teach children as well. And what I have found works for children is honesty. I used to be afraid of my diagnosis and try to hide it and mask my difficulties. And what I found is that is counterproductive. And what I do now is I show my kids through my experiences that I make mistakes, I get things wrong, but I show them how I get around that. And I think my greatest moment was when a child who was diagnosed with dyslexia came back to me after going on to secondary school and said, I was his greatest influence. And that was simply because of my honesty. And I showed him that I'm not Richard Branson. I'm just a regular person who has a 9-to-5 job and tries my best and makes mistakes. And I think them seeing that we're not all going to be Richard Bransons and Whoopi Goldbergs, but just being real people, I think that really helps make it real for them.
Thank you. Just on the countdown point, I just wanted to relay, I actually spoke to Susie Dent about this of Countdown, and she said a surprising number of their contestants have dyslexia. And I have tried to follow up to get her to give us some data, because that'd be great, but haven't had that back, just to put that in there. I have a question about research. So I'm just wondering what you feel the state of research into dyslexia is at the moment. Has research in dyslexia had its heyday, or is there a lot going on that we can be very optimistic and excited about?
Well, I think, in a sense, it has had its heyday in that I think we do have an extremely comprehensive understanding of the causes of dyslexia and also of its consequences. We still have to convince policymakers, and the only way, in fact, we're going to do that is not by talking about the nature of dyslexia, but actually by showing that through interventions you can actually do something about improving the educational attainments of people with dyslexia. Now, that may not be the right way to go. That's the way the research field is going. So, I mean, obviously, there's still some neuroscience and genetics going on, which is refining our scientific understanding. There is a lot of work now looking at robust trials of evaluations of interventions. But what there isn't is really any consideration of what I might refer to as alternative pathways. So generally, the thrust of research has been find out what it is and what you can do about it, but keeping in the kind of conventional track, which doesn't necessarily address, I think, what Darren and Onyinye are saying. What we need to know from an evaluation point of view is how beneficial can assistive technology be? At what age can you introduce it? What pathways can we talk about, drawing on skills
more perhaps vocational routes through an education system. So I think researchers are not looking at that, and they probably, I mean, that's, I think, a very worthwhile direction for research to go. But in terms of the more conventional direction, I think we really have a full understanding of the causes from a cognitive point of view, refining the genetic and neuroscientific understanding, and developing robust interventions. From my perspective, it's still important to have early intervention to ensure that children, by the time they transition into secondary school, have got good grounding in literacy skills. But for those who are unable to reach that, then I think we need to be thinking about alternative pathways, and researchers should be looking into that. Thank you.
But also research into other cultures and other people. Dyslexia, for me, did not present how my white teachers thought it would. I mean, try and pronounce some Igbo dishes. You know, it's just, this is what I've grown up in. This is what I had to figure out a way of doing at the moment, because I'm trying to do research into, okay, how does dyslexia present in Black communities? No one's written a paper on it yet. So if anyone wants to, I'm happy to co-write.
There is some research in the US, in fact.
Yeah, the US is much better, but come on, Britain. We're meant to be better than them.
There's another question here. Yes, please. Can you wait for the microphone?
Oh, thank you. And I think the Chinese society also has similar issues with the Black society as well. I think we need more research in these kind of groups. And also, my another question is, I was diagnosed with ADHD, so I get my extra time. I was actually diagnosed with dyslexia as well, but it was diagnosed in English, so I'm not sure if it's valid, so I will use my ADHD example for my extra time. And so I'm using my extra time for my test, but I'm also, I'm often wondering, will using my extra time for exam affect my performance in the future? Like, should people who diagnosed with dyslexia or ADHD try to not use extra time in the exam? Because I'm actually thinking to not use extra time next year or this year, but just to try to challenge myself, because I've read a book called How the Brain Changes Itself, something like that. And it was about a book, it was about plasticity. Plasticity. So I'm just curious, do you think that we can train ourselves to not use extra time?
Please don't do that. Please use your extra time.
Don't do that.
Please do not do that. So I spent a summer semester at Tsinghua University. So I lived in Beijing. So for context, Tsinghua is like, you think Oxford and Cambridge is something. That laugh should tell you everything. And when I was in China, I said I'm dyslexic. They were like, yeah, we don't believe in that. So I used to stay up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning doing my assignments, which I ended up getting the highest grade in the cohort, but I was having like 2 or 3 hours sleep a night. And then I'd get up at 6 or 7 to continue. So I understand exactly what you're saying about dyslexia, learning difficulties in the Chinese culture, because I lived there and experienced it, and it's hard. And I really hope that there is research done there as well. Please use your extra time. So I was often the only person and I had to sit right at the front of the hall. I read on yellow paper with canary yellow paper. So if I dropped paper when I was at school, everyone knew it was my piece of paper. And I was ruthlessly bullied for it as well. But the extra time was the making of me. Please don't feel like you can change the makeup of your brain. Don't challenge yourself by, that's not even a challenge, that's just like torture. The extra time has been given to you because they know it will help you thrive. You've asked a very good question about extra time in the workplace. I'm currently working with the BBC because I did a LinkedIn post, an angry LinkedIn post about Glow Up, when they don't give the contestants that have openly said that they are neurodivergent, dyslexic, ADHD, extra time in the challenges. In the UK, we have something called the Equality Act 2010. So they have to give you that extra time if you've got a diagnosis that says you need the extra time. I also think that you should be really proud of coming so far already. Neuroplasticity, you and I could both struggle saying that one. The fact that you're reading books about it and stuff is amazing, but you should just be proud of being you. Take the extra time, use it to the max, because your peers are jealous that you have that extra time. Finish that exam, check it over and over again, and I'm sure you'll be fine.
But also with your extra time, practice using it. Don't just go to the first exam with extra time. Practice using it and find out what helps you. What do you need to do in that extra time? Because not everybody wants to do the same thing in the extra time. Some people want to read the questions more. Some people want to check. Some people just want to go slowly. You need to practice using your extra time.
What she means is when you're doing a past paper, like when you're revising, if you have 25% extra time and they said the paper is 1 hour, you do the paper in 1 hour and 15 minutes in your own time and see how you use that time. So you might use the time to read the questions again. You might need to write more, for example. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Another question? Yeah, please. There's two here.
Thank you. It's a great question about neuroplasticity, and I'm working with King's on making neuroscience more available to the general public. So we're spreading neuroscience and trying to improve outcomes in healthcare education, industry. And part of that is around understanding of neurodivergence. And I'm really interested in the fact that, there's so much we do know about the brain now and how it changes right the way through life. And there are lots of things that we can do which can improve outcomes, which might be about having cognitive strategies, and they might be the way that you think about something, but that it does physically change the brain. So we're not going to get rid of dyslexia, but you can do things which make you better able to thrive with the dyslexia. And some of the research has shown that teachers who have an understanding of neuroscience, a lot, but understand some of the neuroscience behind neurodivergence, treat it differently. It reduces stigma, and I wonder, at the moment there is no neuroscience education in teacher training, or not that I'm aware of. Is there any steps to change that?
I'm not sure that any of us are really directly involved in teacher education, but I mean, I think teacher educators would say, there's the same problem about they don't teach about dyslexia, is that there is just so much teachers have to learn that to actually put it in the curriculum is really problematic and impossible. Certainly it could be an important topic for continuing professional development and learning, and I would say the same about genetics. And again, it's always interests me that at conferences, if you have workshops going on about teaching practice, and you have workshops going on about neuroscience and genetics, the teachers all go to the scientific ones, and rather than going to the ones which are actually directly targeting their professional skills. So I think there is an eagerness to learn about neuroscience, but I don't think any time soon it's going to be in teacher education. I just hope that we continue to educate teachers so that we have increasing teacher supply, which is currently not in a great position. Do you want to add anything to that? No. This lady here, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Lydia. I'm a paediatric doctor. I was diagnosed with dyslexia 2 years ago at 30. Thank you so much for giving this talk. My question is the book on Audible? Because I was looking for it and I couldn't find it.
Yes, that is a good question. Unfortunately, there is no audio version of the book as yet. We're hoping that if the paperback and the hard copy sells pretty well, then we can make a better case to the publisher to have a recorded version also. But currently there is no recorded version, I'm afraid.
But dyslexia is in the title. Surely that's a case enough.
I'm afraid all publishers are really rather reluctant to make audio versions until books sell. I have the same with the small very short introduction to dyslexia. Had a lot of criticism because it's written for a lay audience, so why isn't it available audio? Answer, publishers won't do it.
Wow.
So that's another thing for the for Darren to try and tackle, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So we've got lots of labels. We've got dyslexia, dyscalculia. Do you think there might come a time where we get rid of labels and start looking at the kind of the essence of what the different...
You put the microphone closer.
Sorry. Can you hear me? So what I was saying is we've got lots of different labels and there's a lot of crossover between different conditions. And I was wondering if you thought that there might come a time where there won't be specific labels like dyscalculia and dyslexia and so on, but there might be a time where it's looked at as what the difficulties are, and that's where we find strategies, or how the strategies are determined.
Well, can I just say there is a technical term which is neurodevelopmental disorders. I think a good psychologist doing an assessment ought to, if they're going to use the label, ought to then describe the cognitive difficulties. I think that it's useful to have labels because labels do communicate. And one of the problems with dropping labels is that it doesn't give you any idea of what the interventions are likely to be. So I think, and certainly I know in Brazil, my colleagues there are now using the diagnosis of neurodevelopmental disorder. So you could say neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by difficulties in reading, spelling, maths, attention, or whatever. A lot of people, of course, don't like the term disorder. So really terminology is a minefield. But I think we always do have to remember that labels do communicate, and that's quite important.
There's a mental health benefit with a label. I can tell you now, my Nigerian mother does not want to hear the word disorder and her child's name in the same sentence. So that's going to cause a lot of friction for certain communities. But one of the things I'm very open about is that due to my dyslexia, I have really bad anxiety. And finding out that I'm dyslexic at the privileged age of 11 dropped that anxiety massively, because it was no longer you're dumb, you can't spell, you can't read, you can't write. It was no, you have a condition, and this is what this condition is associated with, and these are tried and tested things over, as we can see, hundreds of years that will help you get better. So I think Maggie is right. I see where you're coming from, and actually I'm in the middle with the whole label thing, but for the mental health side, for somebody who has a lot of anxiousness about it, it can help.
I fully agree. I think that labels can definitely be a positive. I'm just thinking of my daughter's voice.
My daughter has DCD. She's, because of the ignorance around what that is, she often feels hard done by, because if I say I'm dyslexic, people automatically know, but with her they don't. And then she's struggling to get support and help because people are unaware of how to support and help her. But we share certain similarities with our processing difficulties, for example. So when I was asking the question, I was sort of thinking, because there's a lot of crossovers in some areas, I wonder if that might be something that is picked up on. But I think you kind of address that with the kind of the blanket term. But I see both sides of what you're saying. It's a positive as well as a negative. And I completely agree with you in terms of my label saved me. So, yeah, I get that.
From a theoretical point of view, one of the really difficult things around diagnosis and terminology is development. Because as children develop, often difficulties that have been hidden at one developmental stage become evident at a later developmental stage. And I think this is very, very characteristic of dyslexia, which is highly comorbid with attention disorder. But normally as children, the attention problems are not noticed because all kids are kind of all over the place. But as the child gets older, and the attention problem often will become more important and more difficult than the dyslexic problem. So it's a really interesting, but I think difficult area. So thank you for raising. I think we've got one more question here, and then I think we're going to actually just sum up and have a drink, please.
Oh, sorry, I did have two questions. I'll do
You
the
can
first
ask
one.
two, yeah.
So I feel really bad saying this at university, but I never went to university. I feel like I'm about to get struck down by lightning. But at the school that I went to, through probably reception to year 9, was a state school. And I was undiagnosed as dyslexic. I was diagnosed as stupid. And they were going to put me in foundation for all of my exams, which means I wasn't going to get above a C in anything. Thankfully, I was in a privileged position where my parents could move me out of that school and take me to a private school where I was then diagnosed as dyslexic. And my older sister also had the same issue, where she went through state education her whole life. It was only until she went to university was she diagnosed as dyslexic. So my question really, what are the strides in state schools where they don't have the funding to diagnose so many students as dyslexic, and then so many students are then left behind? I mean, in my GCSEs, I got an A in maths. So I then sent my results back to the previous school just to say, like, I got the results. But my worry is there are so many schools that are underfunded and don't have the funding to diagnose students like myself as dyslexic. And then we're sent out into the workforce with thinking that we're just stupid, and we're not stupid. So my question really is, what are the strides with helping state schools get the funding so that more students can be diagnosed as dyslexic?
It's legislation.
That sounds like a policy question for Philip.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Maggie. The trouble with being the historian on the panel is as we get closer to the present, I know less and less about what we're talking about. I mean, in terms of, it's very sad to hear that experience. I think one of the reasons it's sad to hear that experience is, as I was saying in the talk, Hinshelwood, writing in 1900, knew that dyslexia was not related to general abilities, your abilities in other areas such as mathematics. He knew that 120 years ago. So it's obviously very sad to know that those kind of mistakes are still happening. Those kind of mistakes are still happening today. I mean, in terms of school funding, again, I think I'll have to defer to the other members of the panel who will know more about contemporary policy on that. But yes, just to say, it is sad to hear that experience is still common.
At the conclusion of the Rose Review, there was £5 million put into teacher education, which was a very important stride. That, of course, when the coalition government came in 2010, that all kind of immediately disappeared. But what you say is really about resourcing education, because if we were sitting here in a dyscalculia audience or an audience of people with developmental coordination disorder, they would be asking the same question. So I think it's really difficult for schools to deliver a mainstream curriculum for all and also cater for special needs. Definitely education is under-resourced, and definitely it should be thought of as an investment and not a cost by governments. So we can only hope that some wonderful politician will emerge and will say what one of the former Prime Minister said, education, 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 but sadly, we still have an underfunded education system. I think I'm going to ask each person just for a few concluding comments. So I'm going to start with you, Darren.
Concluding, as in kind of a wrap-up?
Yep, whatever you want to say.
I don't know why I needed. This is the thing, how the dyslexic mind works, is I think my mind's gone to sleep now.
You also have ADHD, to be fair.
ADHD, yeah. So I've been up since 6, so we're all good. So I guess, one, it's been absolutely tremendously wonderful to be invited to be on this panel and the incredible work that everyone is doing to kind of raise more awareness around dyslexia. I just hope that, we just continue to support each other and strive to make more awareness. Now, I know we talk about policy changes and all the other bits and pieces, but I firmly believe that it stems from awareness, and then we can start the conversation on so many other things. So if I can do anything at all, please do connect with me on the main social media channels. There's quite a few of them. And please use my connections or anything else that I can do further this conversation. But just want to thank everyone for your support.
Thank you. Onyinye.
First of all, it's so lovely to be back at King's, albeit not as a student. I actually chose to do Philip's module, but it got full because it's really popular. So it's nice to actually sit next to you because I never got to do social justice. But I did social justice by writing a book. So I think there's a QR code where you can scan it. Thank you, Cleo, and thank you for all the effort you've put into this event. And if you scan it, you can buy the book. But aside from that, I am so passionate about showing people that dyslexia, neurodivergence doesn't look one way. It doesn't have a look. It's not for a person. You can be from quite literally any background and be different, and that's something to be celebrated. So if that's the only thing you take away from today, as well as getting Philip and Maggie's book, then that's our job done. Feel free to connect with me on social media. It's literally my name across the main platforms. And yeah, carry on. Let's carry on the work around spreading the goodness that surrounds dyslexia.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Onyinye. Well, I think building on Onyinye's point from earlier, so I can only really comment as a historian, but I want to make sure I'm being fair to the people that we profile in the book. So Sanjay Naidu, it's not on this slide anymore, but Sanjay Naidu, who was the director of the Word Blind Centre in the 60s into the early 70s, so she came from an Indian background, and her work at the Word Blind Centre was absolutely crucial at that period of time in creating a kind of evidence base for dyslexia and actually for getting dyslexia off the ground. So I would hope that women like Sanjay are given due testament in the book, and that's one of the reasons that we did write it.
Thank you very much. Well, I really just want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank you for your interest. I think we've heard a whole range of views and issues. I think we've learnt that what's really important is honest communication, that we need to be thinking about other languages and other contexts, and particularly reaching out to minority audiences. But I think with no further ado, I'd like you to join me in thanking Cleo, thanking King's College London, thanking the panel, and when that's over, you can buy our book, but only if you have cash. But Philip and I were very happy to sign any of the books that you do want to buy. Otherwise, you can order it online, and then you have to track us down for a signing. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming.